at the men's camp out. Although I would say the version of the devotion then had a little bit more flannel and sawdust on it. I'll put it that way. This one I'm going to soften it up just a tad and reapply it. Anyway, I do appreciate you all being here. Pastor, he is on the mend. Is on the mend. I know I've spoken to each one of our pastors, and Cody actually is pretty well, but just in the interest of keeping everybody else safe, and I know that Laurie's been sick, and I think she has COVID, and as far as I know, she's on the mend as well. So I mean, we should, starting on definitely by next Sunday, we'll have several of our staff members back here at the church. So, but do keep praying for them. It's tough. Pastor's had a little bit more of a struggle because of he's got his MS symptoms and things like that. So, it makes it a little bit harder, when your immune system's compromised. So, definitely keep him in your prayers. This morning, I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and the devotional or the devotion that I did at the camp out was all based around very familiar story of David and Goliath, and I know we've heard this story many times, and what I really wanted to challenge the men is I really took a close look. I've actually been doing my personal Bible study time. Yes, by the way, children's church. See, I knew I was going to forget. I knew it, but I was holding out hope that I would remember, but I didn't. Anyways, all right. Thank you, ladies. Oh, you won. Yes, as I was preparing, devotion for the men's camp out, what I wanted to do is obviously it's got to be a big manly message, and I've been doing a personal Bible study through 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. There's really good outside of like the book of Nehemiah. There's some really good leadership advice, and we see some really great Bible leaders in these books of the Bible. And but one of the things that have really caught my eye as we look at David as a man is I can really relate in some ways to David in that he really loved the Lord. But there were some times in his life where he kind of let some compromises get in there and sort of pull him off track. But something I found interesting as I was reading through, and I was looking at chapter 17, is with his fight with Goliath, and I just thought it was real interesting because we don't hear a whole lot about David prior to that. I mean, we do read about Saul and Israel wanting a king, and but anyway, taking a little bit closer look at David. Basically, the name of this devotion, I've sort of renamed it Faith, Hope, and Stones, Preparing for the Unseen Battles that we have. And, the one thing that I want to bring up about this is that David didn't fight Goliath being fully prepared for that fight. He just kind of showed up, and he was sort of placed in a situation where he just kind of moved on what he thought God wanted him to do. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start out this morning, I want to set the stage here, so I'm just going to read chapter 17, verses 1 through 16, so if you'll just kind of follow along with me. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shechoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shechoh and Azekah." And I can't pronounce some of these words, so you're just going to have to bear with me. At Ephes Damim, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, and he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. And if he be able to fight with me and to kill me, Then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had eight sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the three eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to battle. And the names of his three sons that went to battle were Eliab the firstborn, next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the three eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem, and the Philistine drew near morning and evening, presenting himself 40 days. So here we have, the quintessential, what I would call the army battle. You have two opposing sides. You have a big, great valley in between. And, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but, we've talked about, around the men's camp out, we talk about things like, Nephilim and how, God had to deal with giant, basically giant men. And, this is no different. We're looking at a guy who was roughly around 9 foot, 6 inches tall, thereabouts, and his armor weighed around 125 pounds. So, I mean, you kind of paint you a mental picture. This is a very big person. And if you've ever had to deal with a bully, and you've got someone who's big and overpowering, and they're speaking out of their hubris or their pride and their confidence, it was very intimidating. And we have Saul, who was the king at the time, and the Bible's pretty clear. Even he was afraid himself. It's quite likely Goliath may not have been the only guy that was his size that was out there. So anyway, he was being very intimidating. And of all of these, Judah's army, and by the way, Israel has always had a very, what I would say is a very dangerous or very well-trained army. And I doubt that it was any different at this time. But we're talking about men who were familiar with battle. It says the battle was in array, so these guys knew what was going on, but yet they were afraid. They were afraid of what Goliath was going to bring. So, I know that if you think about it, there's lots of times when, and this isn't necessarily a devotional about fear. The point of the devotional that I'll get to more elaborately in a moment is, when we live life, and this is particularly true with adults, when we're fathers, wives, mothers, and husbands, just the family relationships and the dynamics that we have. We face problems each and every day. And a lot of times our battles that we need to face are internal. Sometimes there's things that we need to fight in terms of bad habits. And one of the points that I made at the camp out was, there's been lots of times that through God's Word or through a family member or a friend, I have things pointed out about me sometimes that I have to deal with. And and it can be quite scary. And whenever we look at the battlefield and the way things are laid out here, they're a very large foe that they're having to face, and they've got some decisions to make. The main thing looking at David, we're gonna introduce him here in just a minute. Is we're gonna look at how he dealt with some of this stuff. And pull some things out of that. So I'm going to continue on. I'm going to read verses 22 through verse 32. And it says, And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. So, here we have David doing what his dad told him to do. He's bringing some food and some sustenance for them, and basically just checking on their well-being. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake unto the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done done to the man that killeth him. And Eliath his eldest brother heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and thy haughtiness, and the haughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, What have I now done, that there is not a cause? And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with the Philistine. So, we have David who shows up. He's making his delivery. And, David, you see, here's the deal. David didn't show up there knowing that there was a battle to be fought. He basically showed up there doing what he was told to do. He was, I'm sure this was something that, whenever the men were off at war, that family members would bring things. This was very routine. But the number one thing whenever we're looking at stuff like this is we need to recognize that there's a battle to be fought, and we have to do it. So sometimes we see things that need to be done, or we see changes that need to be made. And the problem is sometimes we look around, we expect other people to do things, and yet we're not always willing to be the ones to step up. And David wasn't a soldier. David was a shepherd. The soldiers, they were all out there on the field, standing around shaking in their boots. And, he was there as a delivery boy, yet he recognized the fight to be had. He stood, decided, if they're not going to do it, then I'm going to do it. And so, we have to recognize that there's a battle to be fought, and we need to be willing to stand up and fight. And like times, that could be true for personal battles that we have in any situation. But, the first thing, though, that we have to recognize is we have to know we're going to fight the right battle. And a lot of times we will, get ourselves distracted fighting the wrong battle. And I know that there's been times where I have allowed myself to get so sidetracked on things that I thought I should have been doing. It's very difficult sometimes to stay focused, especially for me. Michelle will tell you that I have a very short attention span. It's very difficult sometimes to keep me on task. But anyway, with David, we know that based on what we're seeing here, he saw, and I think he knew that Goliath was going to have to be shut down, because he was seeing the efficiency of the army. We have to recognize too, we get really sidetracked in life, and I know for me, sometimes I get really bogged down, in the details of life, and distracted from realizing that there is an enemy. Someone who, and especially, I had this focused at the men, but, if Satan can get to the men of our country and of communities, if you look at the demasculation of men, nowadays, the masculinity in and of itself villainized. I mean, it's something that we're seeing more and more, and because of that, we're seeing more women step up than men, and that's a big problem. God called us men to lead our communities and our families and things, and I just see a weakness there. And so, anyway, we just need to recognize that there is an adversary out there that really wants to win, and the thing is he takes a tactical approach. That unlike Goliath here, most of the time when Satan wants to get to somebody, he's not standing on the front line. waving his shield and his sword. He's usually sneaking around in the background. I know that there's been times in my life I've even had kind of prosperity that I considered to be a blessing from God actually be a distraction that kept me out of ministry. And we've all seen things like this happen, but sometimes it's blessings from distractions. But sometimes not all blessings are from God. You should always remember that. But anyway, is something that David did. We're going to take a look at that here in just a minute, how he prepared. So let's just continue to read. I'm going to read verses 34 through 37, and then I'll just skip on down to 40 through 51. So starting in verse 34. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant keep his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took the lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he had defied the armies of the living God. And David said, Moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, and he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. All right, and then I'm just going to skip on down here to 40. Yep. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked out and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with the staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and unto the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of the host, the God of the armies of Israel, who thou hast defiled. This day will the Lord deliver thee unto mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with thy sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you unto our hands. All right, so I'm going to stop there just for a second. So the one thing that we can definitely glean from this, reading this about David, is he had a pretty fair amount of confidence here. I mean, I would say, for someone who, I did a little looking into it, and most scholars believe David was between the ages of 16 and 19 years old. So he was fairly young. Very skilled mostly at watching the sheep. And ask myself this: there's absolutely no record in the Bible that God physically spoke to David. I'm talking about like a burning bush incident with Moses. So we can just taking that if we take that at face value, then it would stand to see that David clearly had a relationship with the Lord, but he never necessarily spoke directly to God. Now, we know that later in life that God spoke to him many times through prophets, and God used men to come and talk to him. But I thought that was interesting because, we don't see outside of when Samuel himself showed up to anoint David that David really had any interaction with, with any prophets at that time, and maybe God did talk to David directly, but my point is this: David had the same conduit to God that we do. And one of the things that we also know about David is David spent a lot of time out in the field with sheep, and we know that he's a great musician. And I'll tell you what, you don't get as good as David was, and if you read on, you'll find out that David was he was really an amazing person. I'm just telling you, he was a great musician, and he got away from worship field all by himself with the Lord, also in prayer. So I think that David was prepared, even though he didn't realize it. I think at the time he was doing all these things, God was really, his relationship was really ironclad with God at this time, at this point in his life. And how did it get that way? By David choosing, when he was out all by himself, to love God, to talk to God, to sing and praise the Lord. And there's a lot of times I find myself being so distracted that I don't get that alone time with God. And it's one of those things that you just have to purpose to do it. But, one of the ways David was prepared for this battle was his relationship with the Lord. He was, I think he was very close to God, and God definitely loved David. The resolve that David had in, a couple of things too. As a guy, I like to look at some of this stuff and ask myself questions. Pastor said that before, but I find that it makes my Bible study a lot more interesting. And, when we look at David's description of his encounter with the lion and the bear, he says the paw of. Well, you don't get a lot closer to your enemy than being. That means he was up close and personal with his with what wanted to eat him basically, and he managed to pull this off somehow, being able to defeat them. And one of the things I was telling the men at the camp out that I thought was interesting is really, if you think about skill level here, Goliath, he's a big, he's 9'6", iron, got all his armor on. He was big, but he was slow. Imagine how good his skill to be able to defeat a lion and a bear that probably moved very quick. They were stealthy. They could get around. They knew how to hunt prey. And here's big dumb Goliath out there. Now he was big and strong, but in terms of danger level between more dangerous to fight some big or to fight the lion and the bear. To me, it to show that one of the reasons why David wasn't afraid, God had already helped him defeat this lion and this bear. So Goliath was going to be, as intimidating as it was, these men, these soldiers, David wasn't intimidated at all. There was absolutely no question in his mind. To him, Goliath seemed like a much smaller adversary than what he had already seen in the desert out there protecting his sheep. And I ask myself this too. I wonder if, with David being close to God, I wonder if whenever this lion or this bear came to attack him, if he ever questioned his relationship with God. Did God care about him? God, I sing you these hymns. We talk a lot, and here now I'm having to defend my life against these things that want to kill me. I don't understand why you would allow me to have to go through this when I thought we were as close as we are. And, and it's just so interesting that, sometimes we forget that God sees our path from what I call the 5,000-foot view. All we can see is what we can see right here in the middle of life. And little did David know that God might use those instances to build his confidence for a battle and a fight. And honestly, if you think about it, David did a lot of stuff through his life. God designated him to be one of the great defenders of Israel in his own way. And this was a stepping stone. It was something that David had to endure in order to be ready for this fight. I think sometimes we might underestimate or we may forget that sometimes these challenges that we're given might be a way to mentally or physically prepare us for something greater, some that God has for us. But it all started with a relationship with the Lord. David would not have been able to have been used for this situation. And by the way, side note, just as this is a man perspective, the speech that David gives to Goliath is something that makes hair grow on my chest every time I read it. It's just amazing that David, this 19-year-old kid, steps out there and basically puts Goliath on notice. And, and of course his brother, I thought it was kind of funny too that his older brother accused him of being full of pride, not really knowing the backstory. Now, I've done that too. I've actually made some assumptions myself about somebody without actually knowing the backstory. And, I was asking myself, man, when I was reading through that, Could it have been a little bit of pride on David's behalf? So that's absolutely not. And the way we know that's because David won. God is very much against pride. If you go back, and especially if you look at Jesus' ministry, boy, that was one of the big topics, is pride. And I promise you, if David had tried to do this in his own pride, there's no way he would have won. And I'm about to prove that point in just a minute. So with one of the things that I thought was interesting too, as we're reading down, and we read through verses 40 through 44 there, where David arms himself. And so I was looking at okay, so he's preparing himself. He's already turned down the king's armor, which I thought this is something too that this is a good life lesson. David turns down this armor because it had not been proven. Man, how many times do we take up things that have not been proven in our lives? And God has given us so many great details about things that are proven, and so I just thought that was a great principle. But I was looking at David. There's this little subtitle in my Bible here that says David arms himself. And I thought, okay, so David, what did he go out there? Well, it says he had a staff, said he had a sling, and he chose some stones. What about any of those things says battlefield? What about any of those things says battlefield weapons? Absolutely none of them. When you look at the battlefield weapons, they all had, we're all talking about long swords, short swords, knives, daggers, shields. There's a long list of things that you can go through the next several chapters, and you can find that there were tools of war, of battle. And these were not any of those. And I thought that was quite interesting too, that David basically took what was essentially just shepherd stuff. Something that maybe he could kill a rabbit with while he's out, to gather his supper. Something I thought too was interesting. And this is a side note too. This kind of gets into some loose territory. But David chose 5 stones. I actually checked this out, and I have some notes that I made in here. But it turns out that Goliath actually had 4 brothers, and I had heard that before, and then I thought, I should look into that. And it's true. Goliath had brothers. I wonder, was David preparing himself because, by the way, all his brothers were big? I think Chronicles, and there's actually a couple of accounts of them. And by the way, I think they were all killed at David's hand, or at least indirectly. When you go back through, they were either killed by someone David trained or David himself. Anyway, I just thought that was very interesting. But all that said, so he chooses things that are not for battle. But you know what? You know what he did choose? He chose things that were familiar, and he chose things that felt like God would use. And one of the interesting point here is that David could have just said, "Okay, God, I'm going to show up. I'm going to speak these words. I'm going to go out there and make a good showing." And then, then on my mark, I'm going to call down fire, and then you burn him up, or something. I mean, there could have been some other plan where David didn't rely on, his abilities. And my point here is that some we have faith, and we want God to move in our life, and then we sit on our bums and then say, well, I'm just going to sit here and pray until God does something. David didn't do that. David moved forward. I mean, and here's the thing, although David was pretty would do something, there's no indication here that God said, okay, David, you go out there and I'm going to make this happen. He didn't have that message. What he did know is that as long as he kept doing what he thought he should do, and he take his time, he made his choices, that God would use all of these things in order to bring victory. And so David going out there and choosing the stones, is, to me, is him doing something. The analogy I like to use is, a car has front wheels that will take it in the direction it needs to go, but the rear wheels need to be propelled. You know, sometimes we need to have our back wheels turning so that God can take somewhere. Because you can sit in a car that's sitting still, you can turn the steering wheel all you want to, and nothing's going to happen. Or you can have your wheels turning, and if there's no guidance there, then you're just going to go all willy-nilly and probably run off of the road. But God, steering mechanism, if we are moving forward, if we're pushing forward, if we're doing something, and sometimes we need to just be doing something. You know, even if it's not much, even if we feel like it's going to have no effect. Just being able to move forward to give God an opportunity to use us is extremely important, and I think that's kind of what David was doing here. You know, one of the ways that we can know that that's kind of how things went is because the Bible's pretty clear when we read on down. And let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and read the next few verses. And so let's just read verse 48 through 51 real quick of chapter 17. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead. And he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head wherewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So, you know, so here we have David. He's armed up. He's got his shepherd's gear with him. He's got his little bag. And I looked up what a scrip was. It says, you know, in verse 40, it just says, and he put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had even in a scrip. And a scrip was basically this bag that slung over your shoulder with a little pocket in it. So he had his little pocket of stones, sling, and, you know, one of the things, too, that right up there with David's speech that it just really makes me feel like a man when I read it is that it says that David ran toward the Philistine, as opposed to, he didn't just stroll out there. He was so, like, I mean, you know, who knows why? Maybe it was confidence. Maybe it was, hey, I just want to get this over with, so I'm just going to run out there and make this happen. I mean, nobody really knows exactly except for David himself, but I really feel like it was that confidence that the Lord was going to use him. But he did not waste time. That's something that I got out of this. David didn't waste time. How often do we waste time? Do we waste time whenever we feel challenged, or whenever we're afraid when it comes to things God wants us to do? Sometimes we waste time. David hasted. He ran toward you know, this enemy. And in the way that we know that, you know, God was 100% in this is he hit Goliath with the first shot in about the only place he could have hit him that would have made any difference whatsoever, because the man was covered in armor, and God sort of guided that stone. Now, I don't want to discount David's skill level here, because if you read on, and I'm telling you, if you want to read some interesting stuff, you read about the life of David and some of the things he did. I was telling the men, he was essentially ninja level skill whenever it came to war, from the amount of men he could take down in one hand combat scene to how he stayed quiet and still long enough to stay in the same cave as Saul and all his men, and be able to sneak up, cut a little piece of his clothing off, or a little piece of cloth, and get out of there without being detected. I mean, he had a serious skill level whenever it came to battle and one-on-one and tactics. And at age 19, I doubt he probably had all of that. And I do feel like he probably was skilled with his sling. But if you've ever tried to use one of those slings, I have. I actually have one in my office, our cave time sling. And I did try to use it once. I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with it. Or as I heard somebody say, I couldn't even hit the sky with it if I wanted to. But you know, to be able to have the skill level to do that, and then the force. If you think about that, I mean, even on some of the most powerful slings. I mean, if you're thinking about using the momentum and the way that this tool had to be used, it would have been nearly impossible for you to sink a stone into something as hard as human flesh and bone, and especially to be essentially a kill shot or kill blow. And David, he just had the ability to do that, and I really believe it, the Lord really getting behind what he was doing, and I believe that it was God fulfilling, in David what he needed from David at the time. And as good as David was, he wasn't that good. I'm just going to tell you, he wasn't that good in terms of being able to make that one-off shot like that without God's help. Something else too that I wanted to bring out of this is that because David obeyed God, because David did what God wanted him to do, he didn't waste time, what he did affected everyone around him. It completely changed the course of that entire battle. When David did what God wanted him to do, the motivation of the men changed from shaking in their boots, being worried about, whether they were going to become slaves of the Philistines and all this other kind of stuff. That they grabbed up their swords and shields and ran after them and basically chased them down and did what they were supposed to do and defeat the enemy. And that motivation came when this mouth kid walks out there and basically challenges the enemy, and through God's power, defeating him. And there was a great battle won, all because of David. One person's choice, one person's series of choices ended up turning the tide of this entire battle. And there's a lot to be said about that, because I'm going to tell you what, sometimes I be the pastor. And I get convicted about that sometimes. I'm the one that goes, oh, I'm Eeyore, right? If you watch Winnie the Pooh, sometimes I'm Eeyore. And, it's real easy for us to we want to express ourselves in a negative way, and that's not always a bad thing, but a lot of times the things we say and the things we do can affect those around us. I mean, it can have a negative effect. And when we've talked about at home a couple of times where I've been in a good mood and Michelle will come home and she might gripe about something, and then suddenly I feel like griping. And then vice versa, she can be in a good mood and then I come home and I'm griping about something, and next thing you know, she's griping about something. So us being able to recognize that the things that we say and the things we do affect other people, it has a big impact. Anyway, as we have these unseen, so there are battles that are yet to be fought. I know that I have some waiting right around the corner for me, and all of us do have those kinds of things. But the way that we can be ready is, number one, spend some time with God. Just in the Word. It could be a devotional if it's nothing more than a daily bread, or just listening to a good speaker that can get you onto a good Bible study. If your wheels are moving, if you're doing something, God can talk to you. It's hard for God to talk to you when you're not keeping that conduit open to be able for Him to communicate with you. So we got to be doing something, moving forward. A little bit of time in worship, and I mean our corporate worship here is great, but sometimes just being in the car by yourself or something. I mean, just taking the time to recognize that we need to recognize God for who He is, and be grateful for what He's done for us, and be able to express that in worship. And then whenever God puts challenges in front of us, we don't need to waste time. Don't waste time. Just do it. And I mean, obviously there is a balance to that. I mean, you don't want to just go into something unless you feel compelled. I mean, God will compel you. I mean, there's going to be times that He's going to say, you do need to do this, and He'll tell you. Then there's going to be some times you're not sure, and if you're not sure, obviously you require more prayer. But just being able to get after it and stay moving, God can use us. God can use us if we're are moving forward. So anyway, I hope this you're able to get something out of a little bit from an old story, and gleaned a little bit from it and was sort of convicted by some of that. Again, I'll double up on my recommendation for reading back through 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. There's a lot to be learned from that teaching. So, all right, Joe, I guess I'll just turn it over to you, sir. Appreciate y'all's attention this morning.